Hello, welcome to another module training for the National Indian Health Board grantees. Today we're going to be discussing the second module in this series of training for project management. Just as a recap for this module series, there are 5 phases of project management that are being covered across the 3 modules, and each of those phases has several components. There's sections and then tools associated with each phase. For our training today, Module 2, we're going to be covering project planning and implementation. The learning objectives for Module 2 there's 4 of them, and after the training, project managers should be able to recognize the 4 components of project planning, describe the tools associated with each of these components, and those that go along with project planning. Project managers will also be able to develop a project budget based specifically on a work plan. And then the final learning objective for project managers in Module 2 is to understand project risks and mitigation steps. The first session in Module 2 is project planning. And your trainers are myself, Iselin Rio, and I'm joined today by Delina Mobley. So to begin the first session of Module 2, we're going to be introducing you and describing the 4 components of project planning. These 4 components include the scope of work, or the SOW. Sometimes this is also referred to as the statement of work, a work plan, a logic model, and a schedule. And each of these 4 components are integral for successful project planning. Each of these 4 components is related to the other components as well, and we're going to be taking you through that by explaining each of these components, as well as doing a demonstration towards the end of the session. So to begin, we're going to cover component number 1, which is the scope of work. Now, you may be thinking, what is a scope of work? And how do you define it for somebody maybe that's never worked with one, or maybe they're new to it? So what a scope of work actually is, it's really a document for a grant that a grantee can reference, and it really just tells you what the work is to be done and why the work needs to be done. It's usually a document that is supplied to the grantee, and this becomes your guiding document that can include requirements, deliverables, schedules, timelines, possible stakeholders, and people involved in the process of completing the work. Deliverables are also included in the scope of work, and what deliverables are essentially at its basic form is what will the project produce. So examples of these are what services will be delivered or what products will be produced. To go along with deliverables is a schedule, and the schedule helps to define specific activities and the sequence in which these activities need to take place in order to complete the deliverables for the work. Now, these 3 pieces of a scope of work are all included usually in one document, and they are usually detailed out very specifically for the grantee to reference at the startup of planning a project.
Thank you, Iselin. So I will talk about component 2, developing the work plan. So you'll notice in your grantee agreement, in your statement of work, that there are tasks associated with your project. Those tasks may be described in the statement of work and have a number associated with them, and they describe the product and the activity associated with that task. So you might have a brochure that you might make for a client, or you might host an event and do a summary report after the event. You'll see later where this particular work plan that will demonstrate for you is going to build on hosting a virtual conference. And so all of the tasks associated with hosting that conference will be listed in the work plan, and you will have due dates associated with each deliverable. And for each deliverable, you want to consider internal deadlines. Those are dates when your team is developing certain components of a deliverable, and your certain team members or upper management may have to approve certain phases of development. So you want to make sure that all of those approval dates and dates where your deliverables are due to your client or due to the funder built into the work plan. The task lead, that's your point person where the project manager can go to this person and ask them any questions about the status of a deliverable. And the task lead has full responsibility of checking in with other team members and making sure that those deliverables are being developed on time and on budget. Deliverables. Deliverables are the actual products that you're going to deliver to your funder or your client. Status, either your particular deliverable has not been started by the team. It may be in progress to where your team members have begun to develop certain levels. There may be certain components of your deliverables that are not in the starting phase of development, but you want to make sure that you track where each component is. And so where you might have begun to start planning for the virtual conference, there will be certain phases that are not completed until the conference is completed.
Component 3 is the logic model. And logic models are a way to help a project team understand visually what the work looks like. Included in a logic model are these different components. Usually there's some sort of goal, and so like the grant goal would be defined here. There's objectives, and this is usually in some kind of plan that's submitted with the grant. There's usually requirements that need to be met, and there's usually objectives where these are articulated to further kind of dive down into the work. Also with objectives, there's usually outcomes and outputs. Now sometimes these two terms are used interchangeably, but they actually are very different. Outcomes are the actual products as a result of doing the work. And outputs are the actual changes that you're hoping to see as a result of completing the work. For outputs, usually for grants, they're looking for short-term outputs and then long-term outputs. And all of these items go back and support the goal of logic models. Usually, logic models are created when a grantee is responding to an RFP or applying for a grant. It usually helps conceptualize and map out the work that the grantee is proposing to do. If it hasn't been developed in the proposal phase, it can be a good idea to support your team and give them something to use for an overview of the work that does include the goals, the objectives, the intended outcomes and outputs as well, to overall support the long-term effects of the work. For logic models, a piece of practical advice on these is to work backwards. And so you really start from your outputs and work back to your goals. And this really helps for planning. If you were to read a logic model from left to right, that is how you then implement the work. An example of a logic model is found here, and you can refer to this in your handout. But what you will see here for this particular program is we have the name at the top here, and then we've included a problem statement along with the project goal. Problem statements, inputs, evaluation, metrics usually can be optional components of a logic model. Just depending on the type of project or grant that you have, you can use these different components interchangeably, and you can select which ones you include and which ones you leave out. Some of the core components of a logic model do include resources. Sometimes these are known as inputs, and so they're things that you're starting off with. Maybe a team, staff members, certain resources, funds, any kind of materials or office space, and then any kind of standing models or programs that are in place to support the work of the grant. Next are activities. And depending on the grant, sometimes a logic model can go to the level of objectives and then list the activities that will be done to meet those objectives, or it can go down into where it drills down into the specific activities, like for this example here. Along with these activities then are the outputs or the direct products that are created as a result of completing the activities, and they're listed here in this column. And then in addition to these, you have your short-term outcomes and your long-term outcomes. So again, for project planning, usually what we start with is our long-term outcomes, and we're able to populate those here in a logic model. And then we go through these additional components and backfill, so that way we get an idea of planning our work. All of these items and components in a logic model will be done to then support the project goal, which has the long-term impact of addressing the problem that's stated here.
Component number 4 is the project schedule. The project schedule is the most important tool that comes with your grantee agreement that lays out all of the phases and all of the due dates that your deliverables are due. One thing you want to make sure that you do is look at the due dates for your deliverables and make sure that those dates are accurately included in your work plan. You want to take those dates and calendar them on your Outlook calendar or whatever calendar you use for work, where you can set a reminder and even add team members to that reminder so that people get an email or a ping when something needs to be revisited, when something is almost due. I advise project managers not to set reminders on the actual day that things are due, that deliverables are due, or meetings need to happen. I would say schedule them a day before or maybe 2 days before, just in case things aren't progressing as you expected them to. So allow yourself some space to make sure that when you're following up on items that you've calendared with your team, in making sure that they're staying on time, on the timeline that you've already planned with your team, that you want to make sure that you follow up on those things before they're actually due, just in case. When you assign activities to team members, make sure that they understand that they are designated as the task lead. Your task leads are the person that, as project manager, you're going to go to for all of your answers about the status of a deliverable. the status of the development of a component of a deliverable. So your task lead may be the liaison between the project manager and the graphics team. Or you might have a task lead that talks to your vendors that are associated with your conference. So whatever your activities are, make sure each task has an assigned task lead. And you can have more than one person serve as on more than one task. Use your schedule to track progress of deliverables as time goes on. You want to make sure that not only are your deliverables being developed on time, but within budget. And your schedule and your work plan work very closely together so that you can make sure that you have those dates calendared and that you're able to work with your team to make sure that you stay on track.
So now that we've reviewed and explained the 4 components of project planning, we'd like to do a demonstration for you using some tools that we've put into practice on different projects, just to demonstrate this process of successful planning for a project. So what we'll be showing you is some activity in when you get a scope of work, what are the things you should look for? And what are some little tips and tricks that can help you understand and kind of digest and break down what all a scope of work contains and how to start kind of taking the work out of it and moving it into a work plan. In the work plan, Delina is going to show you an example and the different components of it, how you set it up with some of those different areas that she talked about with tasks, status, task leads, and schedules are all involved with that. And then the logic model will just show you how to start to create one based on a scope of work if it is happening after an RFP or a proposal has been submitted. And so this is kind of how you would construct it to help the team visualize the work. And then Delina also has a schedule that she'll be reviewing that directly comes from the scope of work, and this completes essentially this cycle of project planning. And so this really comes at the start of a project. And one thing I did want to just mention here in this is that communication is critical in the startup of a project. So as you're lifting the scope of work and starting to review the schedule and developing a logic model and work plan, it's very, very important that you're communicating this with your team. So that way they get the opportunity to start to understand the scope of work. And maybe they are involved in helping develop the work plan, and then they start to begin having conversations with you about the schedule of deliverables. So I'm going to stop the slides here for just a moment, and I'm going to share my screen. So here on the screen, you will see an example of a scope of work. And we developed this just for demonstration purposes to show you some of the important things that you want to look for when you first get this for your grant. So usually a good tip to do is when you have your scope of work, it's a good idea to either pull it up on your computer or you can print it out and get a highlighter. And what you're going to do is you're reviewing the scope of work is you're going to highlight some key items in here that are directly going to transfer into your work plan and that logic model if you're going to be developing one of those as part of your startup process for planning your project. So sometimes what we've done here, for sake of just this example of having it on the screen, is I'll open it as a Word document. Sometimes they come as a PDF, but you'll have a function as a highlighter. So I'll go ahead and turn the highlighter on for the document. And what I want to go through and look for first is my period of performance. And so you see here under A on the scope of work, we've got a sentence here that clearly outlines the task order period of performance. And this is from January of 2020 through January of the following year. Some grants have a shorter period of performance, and sometimes they have a longer period of performance. But it's always a good idea to highlight this information in your scope of work, so it's very easy to find. Another item in here in this scope of work, there's additional language included in here about the place of performance. That's usually not necessarily critical for a work plan, but it just is information included. And then one of the most important things here is under item C, it talks about the description of the requirements and deliverables, which are very important in developing a work plan and a logic model. But this also touches on having minimum qualifications and then applicable information. But the two I'd like you to focus on usually are the requirements and the deliverables. So it goes on to describe a little bit more in this language down here that the grantee shall provide the following project-specific tasks and associated deliverables. So the tasks is really a structure to help organize the work. And a good tip here is to directly transfer the task number, and the task name into your work plan. So it's helpful when you're reviewing the scope of work for the first time is to go through and highlight the name, number, and title of each of the tasks. And this just is a good rule of thumb, so that way you're not having to flip through, the grant or the scope of work, every time to go look for these things. Your eyes just very quickly drawn to these highlighted areas as you're reviewing. So then another important piece of information sometimes is they'll clarify specific requirements, if you will, for some of the tasks and deliverables. And in this example, it says that the funding agency is anticipating 300 participants for a virtual conference. And in that virtual conference, they're looking for 2 breakout rooms to support task 2. So this is really important information because it's really articulating and giving you the specifics of how your grantor wants the work to be completed. So they're looking for approximately 300 participants at this conference. The conference is supposed to be held in a virtual platform. And they're looking for having 2 breakout rooms during the conference, and all of this is to support task 2. So all of these highlighted pieces of information are good items to include in your work plan.
Thank you, Iceland. I'd like to demonstrate how you can use your schedule to develop a work plan. And your work plan is going to be your project management tool to make sure that your project stays on the timeline that you've agreed with your team to maintain the progression of your project. And you also want to make sure that you deliver your deliverables to your client or your funder on time. So with my statement of work or my scope of work, I received a schedule. And what you'll see in your document is a table, or maybe it will just be text where they have the task number, the deliverable, a list of each deliverable, and a short description of what they are, or a title, a delivery date. These are the dates that your deliverables are due to your funder or your client. These dates are extremely important when building your work plan because you're going to use these dates to backdate your development dates and your internal delivery schedule for your team members. So when you assign tasks for deliverables to be developed, each task lead will work with their teams to make sure that the product is developed by this date or before this date. Sometimes you have an approval from the client before the final draft can be completed. And so you want to make sure that if you have to send things back and forth between the client and an external vendor or someone else that's going to be maybe reviewing or editing your final deliverable, you want to make sure that you have those dates listed in your work plan. Your schedule will not have those phases of development built into it. So as the project manager, it is your responsibility to make sure that all of the phases of development are considered and listed in your work plan. So this is a work plan that is developed from the scope of work Iceland shared earlier. And I've taken the highlighted items, such as the period of performance, the task number and task name, the start date, and those are, start date is the date that your team has agreed to get started on a certain product or deliverable. The due date is, the main due date in the dark gray here is when the product is due to the client, and all of the subsequent dates are the internal dates where your team and members have to complete their components of the deliverable to make sure that it meets the deadline. So you want to make sure that you include the task lead. And if your task lead discusses a revision that maybe you had not considered before, and maybe the final due date has changed for deliverable, you're going to go ahead and put that date in the revised finished. And that's because you've talked to Anna Jones about it already. So also in this sheet, you have your status. You have not started, in progress, or complete. Subcontractors is where you want to list your subcontractors, your external partners, vendors that you might work with to complete a certain task or host an event. In this case, we'll have outside vendors to help us host the virtual conference, and we will make sure that we list those steps in this work plan of all of the external communications that we will have to do to complete a deliverable. And quantity is important. So each phase of the development of a deliverable is not considered a deliverable itself. What is considered a deliverable are the tasks that are listed in your scope of work, such as task 1, project planning meeting. That is the deliverable. And so I have that as 1 because we're not going to count the agenda in filing documents associated with that meeting as a deliverable. The funder or the client, they only really care about the deliverable as stated in the scope of work. And then there's a column here for comments. Comments are extremely important to make sure that you're able to communicate any changes, any considerations that you'd like your team to talk about during the next meeting, or maybe you've completed a task and there were some special exceptions or something like that. You want to make sure that you capture those moments, those ideas, and whatever exceptions in your comment section. So your work plan, it's very important to consider it as your guide or your map to how you're going to complete your deliverables in the time that you agree to. And so I'm going back to my schedule and I'm looking for the first task. This task here, I've listed it on my work plan, but there's more that goes into just a project planning meeting. As a project manager, I want to make sure that I consider an agenda for my meeting. Just a little extra professionalism and style for your meetings. I would always recommend creating an agenda and sending it out at least 24 hours before your meeting, just so that you can stay on track and you can make sure that you are covering everything that you need to cover with your team and your funder in the meeting in the time that you have everyone in the same room or the time that you have everyone on the same call. It's really important to have an agenda to make sure that you stay on track. But the agenda is not a deliverable, so I don't have it marked here as a deliverable that can be counted. However, it is important to complete this task associated with the planning meeting. As the project manager, you want to make sure that your documents are filed so that the next project manager, or if you're going to do similar work in the following year, or if someone just would like to review your work, and in some cases, or most of your cases, you'll have an audit that you'll have to complete, and having all of your files really organized for your projects will help your auditing process run smoothly. So you want to put the step in here to make sure that your team members, whoever you've assigned to a certain task, that they make sure that the documents associated with this kickoff meeting or this planning meeting are filed appropriately. So the next task, the project management plan. As project manager, it is your responsibility to make sure that you map out the time that it will take to complete a deliverable. So when you develop a timeline, you take the due date and you might work with a few team members to even consider what it will take to complete this deliverable by this due date. And so internally, you might work with your team to have the first draft and have all of the deliverables scheduled by January 25th. Even though you don't have to submit your project management plan to the client until the 31st, you want to make sure that you give yourself plenty of time just in case someone gets sick, they call out, and for whatever reason, there's a delay on actually completing this schedule. And then you want to make sure that you put a date in there that you file your project management plan in the appropriate place. And I want to make sure that I reiterate how important it is to make sure that your files are intact as a grantee. So this project management plan was submitted to the client. They approved it, and I wanted to make sure I captured that in my comments area here. It was approved on February 5th, and I attached it to the appropriate file location. The next task, project planning meeting minutes. So your minutes from your very first meeting with your client, you want to make sure that they are submitted when you have agreed to, but then you're going to have a separate meeting to discuss the virtual conference coming up. And this is a meeting where you might invite your meeting planner if you have one, where you might invite your external partner if you're going to have a vendor booth. Some conferences are offering booths for vendors to sell their products virtually, so maybe you'll have something like that at your conference. You want to make sure that you consider any outside vendors or partners that you will work with. So I'm just going to add a line here where I'm going to talk to my vendors. So I'm going to do some outreach. And although we haven't decided exactly what vendors we will use for our event, I want to make sure that we do take into consideration that this is something that we have to do as a team, is talk about this. So I don't want to wait until 8/20 or August 20th to have this discussion about vendors. I'm going to talk to Anna Jones. She's the task lead, and as the project manager and the task lead, we will decide together the best time to reach out to vendors. And so I'm going to put that date in here. And we're thinking, if you have the time to start planning things as soon as possible, then I would like to start reaching out to vendors as soon as we have the project management plan approved. So I'm going to start doing that in February. When you add dates to your work plan, it's important to make sure that the dates aren't on a Saturday and Sunday. So we can see that February 6th is on a Tuesday. So perfect. And so in our next team meeting, we're going to talk about outreach to vendors, and I'm going to work with April Jones to not only list what vendors we would like to reach out to, but also which team members can help reach out to vendors and make arrangements in terms of contracting and making sure everything is completed by August 20th. So moving on to the next task is the actual event, the virtual conference. And so there's a lot of steps and a lot of planning that has to go into the virtual conference. And one thing that I think is really important as a project manager is to check in with your funder or your client frequently if you have the opportunity to. So in this case, this project manager is able to reach out to the funder weekly. And this is only while we're planning the virtual conference because there's so many decisions that need to be made very quickly. And so I like to keep track of the meetings that have already taken place. I like to keep dates. What I do is I take the calendar, and since the meetings are bi-weekly, I count the number of meetings that we will have between the start date of the period of performance and the end date. And I make sure that I tally them here, and when meetings are completed, then I make sure that I subtract from the total number. So you can see I have a little note here that 7 meetings are completed and 9 remain. This is really important to me so that I can communicate with my team about how many meetings we might have left or how many times we might be able to actually sit down and talk to our funder. So you're going to work with maybe your external partners and definitely your funder about a conference agenda. Maybe they've considered you as a subject matter expert, and you do not have to consult with your funder about the conference agenda. But either way, the development phases of that agenda should be built into your work plan. And the way that you describe the phases of development are really important. Just in case someone else from your team at any level or any role of your team can go in and look at this and see what the next phase of development might be. And so you can see where I have draft agenda with client, submit draft agenda to client. We're going to get edits and revisions back from that agenda. We want to give ourselves time to address those edits and get it back to the funder as quickly as possible, or whoever is reviewing and making the final decision and approving the agenda. You want to make sure that you have a quick turnaround internally so that you can get it back to them, and there's not a long, drawn-out process for development and addressing feedback. So we have a date in here where the final is due to the client, and again, I have it built into my work plan that we need to make sure that all of the documents that we've developed so far are filed in the appropriate space. For this particular conference, the funder or the client would like us to hire a court reporter to transcribe whatever happens at the conference. And so there are certain sessions during the conference where public speakers may give a certain address, and you want to make sure that you capture those notes. And your funder or your client, they want to have a good summary. Maybe they want to have a beautiful color summary or executive report that will come from this virtual event. And so it's important for them to make sure that they have really detailed transcription of that event. And so in this case, the after meeting report for the virtual conference is going to be a beautifully published pamphlet that will be mailed out, and that particular distribution will be in another option year for the contract, and not necessarily in this year that we're talking about. This particular grantee agreement describes the work related to the virtual conference, and not necessarily the distribution of the after meeting report. So you'll see where I have this stopped at task 3 as listed in the scope of work. And we have the draft summary notes where the client will receive them on September 8th. They'll send them back to us on the 18th. We do our internal edits and make sure we send it back to the client by the 30th. And we want to make sure that we have our copy editor or whatever final phases of development need to happen before the final document is submitted to the client by October 2nd. So you can see throughout the development phases of each deliverable, there are different task leads assigned. So I have Anna Jones helping with the project planning meeting and all of the associated tasks with that. Heather Thompson is my task lead for the virtual conference. She has meeting planning experience, and she's really good at coordinating events and leading the team along, so I thought she would be great for this task lead role. And then we have Paul Kurd. He is our expert in working with our team to develop a really cohesive set of summary notes, and he works well with the writing team, and he is the person that's going to carry this particular deliverable over the finish line. So it's important that not only have you assigned these deliverables and tasks to your team members, but that they understand that they are responsible for carrying those deliverables over the finish line. As a project manager, another consideration is to develop a deliverable schedule. And this is an additional step that maybe as a project manager you may or may not have time to do, but this is a condensed version of your work plan where you only have the start dates, or excuse me, the task name, the start date, due date, revised finish date, your task leads or who the tasks are assigned to, the status, your subcontractors, the quantities of your deliverables, and comments. And this is a great snapshot of your project where you can share with your team and not necessarily have to go through all of the phases of development as listed in your work plan. Another step that I like to do as a project manager is I like to link my sheets. So if I have a schedule that I've created from the scope of work, if the delivery dates are already listed here, I can save myself a step by going to my work plan, selecting the due date, I hit the equal sign, I go back to the schedule, I click on the date that I want in there, and I press enter. And it automatically links your work plan to your schedule. So I'll do it again just to show you how simple it is. So the project management plan, I'm going to delete that just so that you get a good idea on how it works. Okay, so I'm going to use the equal sign here. Then I'm going to go to my schedule tab. And I'm going to click on that delivery date. And I'm going to press enter. And you can see that that date pops up automatically. I'll do it one more time. So I'm going to press the equal sign. I'm going to go to my schedule tab and click on the date that the project management plan is due. And I'm going to press enter. And you see it will automatically link that date to your work plan. So my recommendation is to build your schedule. You may be able to cut and paste from your grantee agreement. If you receive a hard copy, then just create a simple spreadsheet where you can link your schedule to your work plan. And once you have your work plan and schedule linked and all of your phases of development have been considered and listed in your work plan, then you can create your snapshot for your team.
Thank you, Delina. So after you've gone through the significant steps of reviewing your scope of work, highlighting those important areas, looking at your schedule, getting that imputed into a workable software like Excel is a good one to use, where you can enter in tasks and due dates, and then also setting up your deliverable schedule and your work plan. Sometimes you can lose the forest in the trees, and so this is where a logic model can help you kind of pull back to see the bigger picture and how these different components of project planning, as well as the specifics under each of the component, can come together. So what I have on the screen here is just a very simple Excel logic model template. And you'll probably recognize from earlier in this session where we talked about the different sections of a logic model, the problem statement, project goal, any inputs or resources, as well as activities. Sometimes these are objectives, outputs, as well as outcomes that are immediate and intermediate. So I just wanted to demonstrate a little bit what you would do to kind of start pulling from your scope of work and populating a logic model template. So first thing I would do is consider the project goal. And so for this particular scope of work, it looks like, just based on reviewing tasks 1, 2, and 3, it's usually stated at the top in the introduction to a scope of work. But for this example, looking at the tasks where it's talking about a planning meeting, a virtual conference, and then after meeting activities, it would lead me to believe that the goal is probably something along the lines of, let's just say, and sorry about the typing noise here, distributing information. And maybe going back and looking at the problem statement for this instance, maybe in-person meetings were placed on hold due to COVID. That's something very real for a lot of organizations right now. So I would just kind of put that general information there at the top, and then your inputs. This is going to be resources that you have in place before you even start the work. So for this, I would think, because an in-person meeting needed to be held, I would say maybe there's meeting materials. You're also going to have maybe a location. So maybe I would say this is maybe for your program team where they have an office. In addition to this, you're going to have a program team or staff. And if you remember from Delina's work plan, this was Heather and Paul and Anna. So they're going to fall under that. And so this is just to keep it very simple, to get you thinking along the lines of inputs and resources to draw from. So moving over to activities, what I would do is I would go to the scope of work, and tasks usually are set up in a language where there's some kind of verb or action associated with them. And usually it's a good idea that your tasks, you can kind of think of them like objectives, because they're different sections of the work that need to be done to meet the goal, the overall goal of the grant. So for this sake, I would just copy the tasks, their titles, and I would actually put them in here under activities. And sorry, my spreadsheet is not working with me. I might just have to type these in. So just for time purposes, I would just put in task 1, task 2, and task 3. So that way we have kind of the overall details of our work outlined here. And so I'll just put planning on this one. For this one, I'll put virtual conference. And then for task 3, I'll put post conference. So we have our inputs, we have our activities, and now you have to think of outputs. And so if you remember correctly, outputs are those things that are direct products as a result of the objectives. So in your planning, you're going to hope to probably come away with maybe the day and time of conference. And then also under this, maybe you'll have, and this isn't going to do this very nicely for me, but I'll just say day and time of conference. And normally what it would be is probably like an agenda. So an agenda and articulating when the event is going to happen, that's a product of the planning. One for the virtual conference what you would want to put on here for an output, like this is what you're hoping to see at this virtual conference. And so if you remember going back to our scope of work, down here at the bottom under our tasks, we have this little note in here about the funding agency anticipating 300 participants at the virtual conference and 2 breakout rooms. So an output of the virtual conference would be 300 attendees. So this is the product as a result of the virtual conference, is to end up with having 300 attendees. And then post-conference, this would be, if I remember correctly from Delina's work plan, I think we had recordings and possibly transcriptions as a product directly from the conference. So these would be our outputs, direct products as a result of completing the activities. So then we would move over here to our outcomes, which is where we start to think about, in the short term, what change in behavior or what change, in knowledge, change in approaches, what would happen as a direct result of planning from this conference? What would happen as a direct result from having 300 people attend this conference? And then what would potentially be the result of being able to record and transcribe these conferences? And so in here, you would start looking at maybe there's, I'm just trying to think here, an immediate outcome could be improved planning for future conferences. And then maybe one under the attendees would be increased knowledge on current issues. And that's the change that you're seeing as a direct result from people attending the conference. And then for this last one, our recordings and transcriptions from the post-conference activities, an outcome from this would be possibly like a summary report for stakeholders. So these are just more immediate outcomes, and then long-term is where you're going to start looking at different levels of change to where you're having an increase maybe, or a decrease in activity, or an improvement. Something in some direction represents change. So then the intermediate and the long-term outcomes are going to be kind of that bigger picture that's going to go back to directly support this goal of distributing information. So this was just a basic template that you can use in an Excel software program on your computer for a logic model. And then if you were to wanting more of kind of the really nice graphically designed or, kind of color adherent type of a logic model, in Word, Microsoft Word, there's a function here. If you were to go into Insert, if I remember correctly, and there's something here called Smart Art. And Smart Art gives you all of these different examples and graphics, different figures and ways to display information that work very nicely to create a visual representation of a logic model. So this is what we recommend, is starting off with the basics of your logic model to get all of your information imputed into there, and then moving over more to that aesthetically pleasing look using Microsoft Word. So today for session 1 under module 2, we've reviewed the 4 components of project planning, which includes the scope of work. It also includes the work plan, the logic model, and the schedule. We've been able to explain these to you, also provide tips and recommendations based on our knowledge and what we've experienced in successful project planning. And we've been able to demonstrate some of the ways that we use different tools to successfully complete project planning. So thank you for listening to us today. We're going to go ahead and take a break for about 10 minutes. And when we return, we will be moving into project implementation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We will now be discussing project implementation. My name is Julie Cahoon. I'll be your trainer for this module session. So what we'll focus on is project budgeting. And so I'm going to describe to you the project budgeting process and some of the items related to what makes up a budget. And then we'll also go into deeper detail about how you might want to consider tracking your project budget to ensure that you stay within the grant award amount. So the different things that you're going to need as you begin to prepare for your project budgeting is you're going to need to know the awarded budget amount, or at the very least, what the potential budget award will be. And that's typically listed in the RFP. And then once you are awarded a grant, there will be an awarded budget dollar amount listed in your grant award. And so whatever dollar amount is listed in there is going to be vital to the rest of your budgeting process. The next important key document that you're going to need in this process is a budget projection file. A projection file allocates the awarded dollars to the tasks and considers both labor and other direct costs. And then the next component is budget versus actual. And so this is the part that goes into monitoring your project budget. It helps you to see where your progress is in terms of how staff are working on the project, as well as your other direct costs that are related to your project. And so the budget versus actuals is an analysis that you'll do regularly throughout your project to ensure that you're staying on target and that you're meeting the grant requirements, as well as staying within the grant award amount. And so all of that together is budget management. And so you'll use all of the pieces, the award amount, the projection file as a tool, and then analysis, budget versus actual, to manage your budget. And so this is a process that will be needed to be done monthly. So you'll do monthly updates and reviews of your budget to track the progress, as well as monitor staff activity. So again, to do your budget projections, these are the main documents that you'll need in order to do that. So you'll need your SOW, and so that's going to outline your budget award amount, and that's also going to outline the tasks and the required activities, as has been highlighted in a previous activity or in a previous module. Next, you'll also need your project work plan. So the work plan breaks down your tasks and considers specific staff that will work on the outlined tasks based on skill or experience. And then you'll also need your budget. So what is the dollar amount that you're working with to complete all of this effort, to support you having staff, and to support you using vendors or other outside of your organization staff or activities. And then finally, that all goes into your budget projections. So you'll use all of those aspects, all of those tools, all of those documents to create your budget projections. And so we're going to go ahead and step into a demonstration. And so just to tee up the demonstration, I want to add in a few caveats, a couple notes. So there are a number of ways to do budget management. There are a number of different types of budget projection tools you can use. There are different ways to do budgeting entirely. So before you do your budgeting, you want to make sure that you're working with your organization's accounting team or your billing team. They may already have a budget tool developed specifically for your organization that you're going to want to use. And also additionally, the funder may have a specific budget template or certain requirements that you'll need to use as well. So this demonstration, the intent of it is just to give you an idea of how you might want to consider tracking your project's activity based on your budget, based on your staff, based on your ODCs. And so you'll see it's a very detailed projection file that I'm going to show you. And so I just want to try to highlight some of those finer details and how any shifts or changes within your project can really have an impact on your budget. So I just wanted to go ahead and put those notes out before we begin. Okay, so what we have here, I'm going to go ahead for this demonstration. I'm going to use the same SOW and work plan that was used in the last session. And so that way you can kind of see the steps progress as you work through your project preparations and planning for the implementation. So the first thing that I'm going to go ahead and refresh your mind of is the project work plan. So I'm going to go ahead and increase this and just so here we have the SOW, the scope of work. And so as was previously described to you, the SOW outlines what it is that your team is supposed to accomplish within the grant award. And so that does indicate, the specific contractual agreement language, the period of performance, and again, it goes on to describe the requirements, including the deliverables, and then also outlines the tasks here. So for this particular SOW, there were 3 tasks that were outlined related to a virtual conference. So that included project planning, it includes the virtual conference, and then it also includes a report associated with the conference. And then it also includes, the target number of folks that are anticipated to attend this virtual conference. And so again, that's what your SOW is doing, is it's telling you what you need to accomplish. And so we want to take this information and carry it with us as we move into the next step, which is the work plan. And so that again details, breaks it down, each of the tasks into sub activities. And then it also lists who's going to be doing that work. And so that's a very important piece of information, is who's doing what. Because different staff may be at different rates. They may have different overall work that they do within the organization. And so it's important to recognize that and be mindful of that, especially if for this particular project, for the virtual conference, if staff aren't going to be on the project the whole time, maybe they're just 25% time on the project, maybe they're 50%, or maybe they're full-time. So those are other things that you need to consider based on who is working on your project. And so we're going to take these different components and considerations and shift them over to our projection file. And so again, I want to note that your organization may already have a budgeting accounting process established. So you want to make sure that you're communicating with them and ensure that you're following those protocols first. And so this template is mostly just to show you a different way of thinking about your project and things that you may want to consider for yourself as you work to manage your project. And so I'm going to go ahead and just describe what you're seeing here. And so this is a simple Excel tool that's being used, and it's broken down and includes all of the information that you need about your project. So I'm going to go ahead and just describe what those are. So quickly here, you have this section of the document that's highlighted, and that's listing your staff. So it doesn't have the specific names in here, but this is where you would list who your staff is. okay? And we're going to use these cells over here to indicate the amount of time that they'll be spending on the project in hours. This next section of the document is focusing on the cost for labor. And so that has your staff labor rate in there. And so it does show you the dollar amount. All right, and then the next part of this sheet, it has your other direct costs. And so that includes, maybe you're going to be working with a consultant for your virtual conference. Maybe you'll have a couple of webinars for planning. Maybe you're going to have a couple phone calls and copying and postage. So maybe you'll send out the final report to participants. So those are just other direct costs that aren't related to labor specifically, that will be incurred or that are being considered as part of expenses related to conducting and implementing the project itself. And again, these are all aspects that will most likely already be known to your funder. Typically, when you're submitting your RFA, your response to the RFA, you're already including budgetary information. So a lot of this may already be sorted out beforehand, and so really you're just going to take information that's already been established, that's already been approved, and you're going to put it into a template like this to help you begin your planning. And so this, what you're seeing here is all of the labor, all of the costs, labor costs, and all of the other direct costs associated to your project, and it's all broken down by the performance period by month. And so this is what's really helpful, is that it's broken down by month, so you can really get that detailed step-by-step look at your project as you're moving along. And so in this particular tool, you'll notice that in May 2020, the text is black, and then you'll see in June, the text is blue. And so what this is showing you is that all of the text in black, that is actual. That is what your project actually spent to perform the work for the deliverables and tasks. The blue indicates a projection. So this is your estimate of how much work is going to get completed on those tasks, on the work that's remaining for the remainder of the project period. And so what you'll be looking at from month to month when you're doing your budget management is you'll be looking at the shifts from the actuals versus the projection. And you'll make adjustments to your projections at month by month as you learn what the actual time spent and other direct costs that are spent. So those are the two, a nice visual indicator to you as you're working through. Using color coding can often be helpful in that way. All right, and then the other thing I'm going to toggle over to is the far side of the document here. I know this is small, but I'll zoom in once we get into the details more specifically. I just wanted to give you the layout of what it is you're looking at. And so what we'll see here, this yellow column, that is telling you the budget total. And so this final dollar amount here, this is what you were awarded as part of your grant to do all of the work, to perform the planning for the virtual conference, conducting and hosting the virtual conference, and then completing a report at the end. So you were awarded in this particular demonstration about $75,425 to complete the work. And so what these other columns are showing you is what your progress is. And so here you have the actual totals. And so this tallies up what it is that you actually spent. And so this actuals is telling all of the actuals that you spent from January through May. And that's telling you what has already been used. And so you'll see that as a percentage of the overall total, excuse me. I'm gonna unhighlight that. So you have the percent used. And so for an example, under category 1, your first employee, they've already spent about 11 hours on the project. And overall, that's about 73% of what you projected they would spend. And so that just telling you that in terms of aligning with your budget projections, they have about 4 hours remaining on the project. So that's about 26%. And so again, that's broken out by employee, by overall labor, and that's also broken out by dollars. And then again, that's the same for your ODC. So it's broken out by individual ODC costs, so whether that's the consultant or whether that's webinars or whether that's copying and printing or postage. And then it shows you a collapsed overall total so that you know exactly where you are with the other direct costs. And then the very bottom line is just showing you the total costs that have been incurred based on your budget and based on what your actual spend is and what your projected spend is. And so you'll see that so far, overall, there's been about 99 point, you've spent almost 100% of your budget. And so that total here, 100% of your budget, that's including the actuals and the projections. So if you were to continue with your work from June through December, keeping with the totals that you have here, by the end, you would have about $310 left over. Okay, so it's giving you that full picture from the start to the end, including your actuals and your projections. And so as you see, once you move on down the months, going into January and July, so you stick with those, right? That's not going to change, you know, what you have remaining. And so it allows you to see the smaller shifts within your project. If you stay with your projections, or if you, for some reason, have unforeseen issues, or you have risks that need to be addressed, those will pop up here, especially if you see that one of your project staff is taking more time to complete something, or you have a consultant to help you with the virtual conference and they might spend more money than you expected. You'll start to see those changes here, and that allows you to help manage your project by seeing where the dollars are being spent and how they're being spent. So that's just another way to think about your projection file as a tool to help you manage your project progress and help you to manage and identify any potential risks to your project. The other pieces to this here, so this is all the tasks. This is everything rolled up. So this is a real good snapshot of your project and the state of it at a certain point in time, and that's every time you review it. So we're going to scroll down here, and what you'll see is this here then shows you one task. This is task 1. So this shows us over here in the corner, the project planning meeting. And so this is all of the work that's going to go into the planning. So for this particular task, you'll see that we started planning in January, and the event is going to take place in October. So you'll have up through September to do all of the planning that you need for the project. And so for this particular snapshot, we've worked up until May. And so this is how much work has gone into the project so far, January through May. That's showing us what has already been used. June through September shows us what work we project we have remaining. And so that's when you're going to be able to assess how far you are in terms of planning when you get into June. You'll come to this document, you'll see, okay, your second employee has about 14.5 hours to review documents, review the agenda, and get it submitted to the funder for final review. Your third employee, perhaps they're doing a little bit more of the heavy lift in terms of planning, and they're coordinating the virtual conference, and they're, scouting for speakers, and they're trying to look for maybe some swag. They're just doing the extra research involved. Maybe they're doing community outreach. They're trying to figure out what might be the best platform, what might be good activities to do for the virtual conference. Maybe they're working on registration. So they're spending quite a bit more time on the project than your second employee. And so that's what's going to be shown here, is how much effort one particular staffer is putting on the project. And again, that's important because, as you'll see down here, your staff are at different, rates. They're at different levels. So one might be the program director, and so they're operating on a higher labor rate than, say, the project manager might, and maybe a project support person. And so if for some reason you have staff turnover, this again will show you where you might have to bring your project support and have them take on more of the work. And so you would shift any of the labor or hours to your project support person, and that would change your budget dynamic. And so it's important to kind of just have that kind of laid out so you're not caught off guard in terms of having too much money left over at the end of the grant period, and that you're able to use everything as you thought you would and as you stated you would to your funder. So that's what this level of detail, again, is supposed to help assist you with, is to help you as a project manager see your project task by task, and see, align it with the progress based on what you thought would happen and based on what's actually occurring. So it's seeing everything at the same time, in real time. And so you'll see here that there aren't too many ODCs related to the task one, because that might be, you're not working with any consultants at this point. All of the planning is internal to your organization and to your team. And so you don't need any ODCs at this point. You're not trying to, send any packages. There's not going to be no webinars or anything like that. And so you might print a couple things. And again, these ODCs are specific to your grant award. And so sometimes these types of expenses aren't allowed. And so again, it's important just to always refer to your award document and your SOW, because it does outline all of those things. So this is a perspective of the task one. So we're going to go ahead and shift over into looking at these last columns, because that's going to tell you where you are in terms of the specific amount of dollars that were awarded maybe for this particular task. And so you'll see the actuals. And so again, that's how much has already been spent on this particular task. And then it also gives you that percentage, because sometimes that's easier to report. So if you're the project manager and you need to, you're going into your monthly check-in meeting with your team and you have the project director there, these are some nice numbers to use to kind of quickly share with the team what your numbers are. So you're like, well, we have about, so you'd use these to help you with that, to kind of give you those quick statements that you can use. So just based on this projection here, there's about, whoops, sorry, I'm confusing myself here. So we've used about 444,000. There's about 656 remaining. And if you look over here at the budget remaining for the labor for each of the staff, you'll see right here, this is something that will flag you, is you'll see that the third employee has this bracket 17.9. And so what the brackets indicate on this particular tool is that this person is over their projections. So you projected them at X number of hours, and based on what they've actually spent and what's left projected for them to do, they're doing 17 hours more than what you thought they'd be doing. So it's important for you to then address, why is there more time having been spent January through May than you thought? Because then you'll have to adjust in the projections and account for that 17 hours. And that's 2 days of work. So, it's just mindful to you know, it's helpful to keep those kinds of realities in mind, that 17.9 hours is actually 2 days of work. That's quite a bit of work. You know, what is it? Is there something unexpected that's happening? Is it something that is a potential risk? Do you need to talk about it as a team? And so that's, again, what this type of document will help you do, is to help you flag for any potential risks. And seeing that overage in time is something that will help guide you through the management. And so we're going to quickly toggle down into the next task. And so this task is the actual virtual meeting itself. And so you'll see here that there's nothing listed here in January through August, because there's no work that needs to be performed on this task until the conference is about to begin. So it's scheduled for October. And so you'll see down the column that you'll have your staff all projected out for the work that they need to do for the conference itself, which is separate from the pre-planning, because the conference itself is the day of. So, you know, it's the time for the conference itself. It's time for stuff that you might do beforehand related to the specific event itself. And then maybe some time after the event, just wrapping things up. Maybe it's finalizing invoices for vendors. Maybe it's sending out an email or queue just to wrap things up. And so that's what you'll see here in November. December is just a couple of hours. And so here are the projected staff hours that you have for your team. And then again, this set here is just showing you the dollar amount based on their labor rate. And then you have your ODCs. And this is where you have your ODCs, because at this point, you're going to need your consultant to help you with your virtual conference. So maybe they're coming in and providing the platform for you. And so you're just going to be working with them to ensure that that they have all the information they need, that they have all the back-end information, and then they're going to maybe use it on their software. Okay, and so that's just a rough example of what that information or these dollars amounts would be for. And then, you know, I know that this is just a demonstration, so perhaps instead of sending out the final reports, maybe you're sending out packets for the agenda itself, like meeting materials, agenda, presentation slides. So maybe you're sending meeting materials to registered attendees, and so you'll be using maybe your billing and stuff for that. So then that just gives you a check of where to anticipate the work is going to flow. And so here you don't have any actuals because no particular work has begun yet on this. But you'll see that based on what you know the level of effort will be, that there's a number of staff that are already over projections. And sometimes that's okay. So it really just depends on your management, your understanding of the work that needs to be performed, and the staff that are doing it. So sometimes you might have an overage here by 6 hours, but you see another staffer ended up not having to work on the project at all. And so you have a little bit of a trade-off in hours there that still keeps you within your budget. But for this particular task, we see that overage is actually taking you over your projected amount for this particular task, what's intended to be allowable for this. And so this would become a flag, and you'd want to address it with your team and see how you might be able to mitigate that. So maybe having your second employee do so much work, it might be better to maybe have another staffer take on some of that so that it brings your budget back into balance. And so those are just some of the considerations. Maybe it's staffing, and then it wouldn't, you know, it might not be an issue, and so you can correct it that way. But here in the projections, we see that even our ODCs are over, and so that's also something that is a red flag to address. So what is causing the projection here to be over? And so we'll look that it is related to per diem. Okay, so maybe for per diems in this case, maybe you're and maybe not per diems for this example, maybe we'll say that they're incentives or honorarium. And so maybe you have maybe a few more folks presenting than you had originally planned, but it fits for the conference. And so you'll see that you have an additional $500 for honorarium. And that was maybe unanticipated. And so depending on your grant requirements, you may need to get something like that approved. And so you'll need to approach your funder about that. But again, it's always going back to your SOW and seeing what's allowable and what's within the budget. And then if it makes sense to keep, you know, X number of speakers and issue an additional $500 worth of an honorarium, you'll want to then bring that to your funder and just, you know, present the information. And then, you know, your funder is likely to possibly approve that additional expense, and then that will be okay. And so then you'll just have that in there. You'll notice that it'll just be kind of listed there as a change that was made. So again, that's the benefit of having a projection tool, so that again, you can see any of those changes, you can flag them, you can address them. So the way that we're working in this demonstration is that there is a bit of an overage overall for this task. And so we'd want to address those things like I just walked you through. So we're going to go ahead and scroll down into task 3. And so this is the final report. And so again, the file kind of follows your project. So task 1, it's most of the work is happening in the front end of the project performance period. And then task 2 is kind of towards the middle end. And then the task 3, the final report, is towards the very end of your performance period. So you'll see that all of the hours, there's nothing between January and October, because you can't do anything on that until after the event has occurred. And so you'll see that listed here as a change. So you have all of your projections here for your staff in November and December. And so again, we see here that there's a couple of brackets. And so we want to be mindful of who exactly is going over and maybe why that's occurring. And so we'll see here that maybe a 4th or 3rd staffer didn't necessarily need to perform as much work as you thought when you first made your initial budget for the RFA, and so that's what's being reflected here. But you'll also see that overall for this task, you have about $16 remaining, and so it hasn't impacted your budget overall, but it's important to know why that there's this overage. Okay, so again, you get that flag in your file to help you manage and make decisions about your project. That again keeps you within the scope of your project, keeps you moving along and meeting the task requirements, and also keeping you within your budget. So again, now that we've kind of walked through each of these and you kind of get a deeper level of the breakdown, just going to scroll back up to that overall, you get a better sense of what it is that you're seeing. And I'm going to go ahead and scroll up and zoom in a little bit more so you can kind of see some of that breakdown, because I think that's helpful. Get a steady hands here. Okay, so to see just the different parts of the sheet, you have the labor categories here, just your staff. And then this top level here is just for the hours. So how much time are they spending? And so this is, again, really important for staff that may be 25% on your project, because maybe for the other time they're working on other projects within the program, or maybe in a different program. And maybe you have staff that are working 50% or 100%. So this is really important to kind of have that there, so you can kind of see the change over the months through the course of the grant performance period. And here you want to understand what the impact is to your budget, having staff work X number of hours. And so these columns here give the labor rate for your particular staff, and so you can see what that cost impact is overall across the month. And then we'll just scroll down a little bit and stay on this side of the sheet so you can see the other direct costs. And so you'll see we have consultant, webinar, teleconferences, copying, postage. Please just list what may most likely have been approved by the funder and are listed in your SOW. So this is just an example. So this will change, and this is all dependent on your SOW and what's been agreed with your funder. And so you'll see what the anticipated expenses might be. And so again, that's also helpful for your accounting department as well, so they understand when what to expect on invoices. So we're going to drag the sheet over so you can see the other side. And we'll go ahead and scroll back up. And so again, you'll see the collapsed version here. The overall, it's showing you the total number. So this August, or a more important one is the October and September days, because you had a little bit of time. Okay, so these are all the tasks rolled up. And so there was a little bit of overlap, I think, in September. And so these numbers will tell you this is 43 hours across task 1, task 2, and task 3. So this is showing you total across all tasks, the number of hours that are projected for this particular staff person. And so that you'll see overall, this is how many hours you thought they would use on the project from the very start. So this is what you submitted to your funder, and you said, you know, we're going to need this many hours to do this project overall. And so then you break that number out across the staff that you indicated would be assisting with it. And then this here just shows you the total, what you have remaining based on what the projected work is to be. And this is in hours. And so here you have that transferred and related to you in dollar amounts. Okay. And then shifting down here again, you're seeing the other direct costs that are related to your project. So you have the consultants, you have the webinars, and then you have the postage and the honorariums, as we talked about, are in here. And so you get to just see that snapshot, and you get an overall total. So from task 1, 2, and 3, from your total 75K that was awarded, if everything goes according to plan, or as you shift your projections as the work shifts and you manage those shifts, you would have about 310 remaining. Okay. And so this was just a demonstration of one way to manage your budgets. And I wanted to use this particular type of budget to show you how one way to manage your budgets is because it gives you that detailed level of task by task, staff by staff, month by month. So you can really see the shift, the dynamic change as you work through your project. And so those are all very important things for you to keep in mind as you do your work. And so I'm going to go ahead and just toggle back to the presentation file. Okay, so to do a quick recap, I want to go ahead and just point out to reiterate some of the points I was making about budget management. And so these are some tips. And so as you saw within that particular projection file tool, what's really important, and I think what has been reviewed in these modules, is that you need to have monthly, regular, likely to be monthly, updates and reviews of your project work. And so that includes looking at your work plan, and seeing what the progress is on those particular tasks and aligning that progress with your budget. Are they working and aligned together? So the work plan progress should be matching your budget progress as well. And so you'll just want to have consistent review of your budget. And so I think for a budget in particular, just because of pay periods, doing a check mid-month or following the disbursement of payment for your staff might be a good way to track your budget in particular. But always definitely checking in on your budget at the end or the beginning of a month so that you can see what it is that happened within that last month in terms of hours used or fees spent. And you can look forward to the next month, and then you can begin to anticipate what to expect in terms of what might be accomplished and by who. And so it kind of just gives you that reset and to check in with your budget and the progress of your project. And so again, all of that ties into being able to monitor staff activity. So it's really important to know how your staff is managing the work that they've been assigned. Maybe something is taking them too long because they're spread a little too thin. And so that allows you to be able to see that because they might not be spending as much time as you thought they would be, or they're spending too much time. So those are some of the indicators that will help you manage your project. And then again, it's important to have open communication with your team. So regularly monitoring the budget and then confirm the activity with staff. So if you see that someone is spending not as much time or more time, when you have your check-in with your staff, you can ask them about it. You can ask them about it and just kind of confirm and see what's happening. Maybe at that point in that conversation, you all can talk about where some of the effort might need to shift, or if you need to have another person come support your staff. It's all about being able to balance the workload so that they're appropriate for the staff and you're not burning anyone out, you're not stressing anyone out, and that you're able to meet the task requirements. So again, these are questions to ask if you see shifts in the staff activity. Are the hours under, over, like we talked about? Do they need more resources, whether that's more additional labor support, or maybe they need some other support? Maybe you need to get them a software to help them manage projects or something like that. And then are staff managing unforeseen challenges? And so again, that's why you might see more hours spent in one month, because they're not able to connect with a particular vendor, or the vendor isn't communicating as much, and so they have to spend more time reaching out, sending emails and phone calls. And that's the same for maybe community outreach. They're not reaching their target audience like they needed to, and so they're spending more time on it. And so those are things that are somewhat beyond their control, out of their control, and so you need to be able to jump in and help them, mitigate that risk. And that is actually a good segue into our next session here, and we'll be talking about project risk management. And so project risk management is about risk and mitigation. So it's about identifying what your risks are and then finding ways to mitigate those risks. And so once you have your budget set and you move into implementing your project tasks, it's important to be mindful of the project risks, as we talked about. So risks are unplanned events or conditions that impact your project, whether that's positive or negatively. And so there will always be risks to your project because you cannot possibly control all of the events or conditions within your environment. However, you can use tools and strategies to minimize the impact or eliminate the impact altogether. And so that's when you develop mitigation. And so mitigation is a strategic risk response where a project manager and team can take active steps to reduce the probability or impact of a negative risk to your project. And so risk mitigation include introducing preventative measures into a project plan from the start. And so we will spend the rest of this session discussing mitigation plans and reviewing examples. Okay, and so here we'll talk about project risk management and the mitigation components. So this graph displays the project risk mitigation process. The initial step to risk management is identifying a risk. There are different kinds of risks. Common risks are related to cost, scheduling, and performance. A cost risk is a result of misestimated project costs and also scope creep. A schedule risk example is the result of activities taking longer than expected. And performance risk or quality risk is the result of producing products, services, or activities that do not meet requirements. And so the next step is to analyze and prioritize the risk. And it's helpful to categorize the identified risk. Is the risk internal, external, is it technical, or is it something that's completely unforeseeable? And then once you kind of have got a sense of what kind of risk it is, you want to prioritize that risk in terms of the impact to your contract. And so you might ask, what is the probability that this risk will occur? Is it high, medium, or low? What will the impact to your project be? Is it going to be high impact, or is it going to be relatively low impact? And then the next is developing a response plan to the identified risk. How will your team minimize or eliminate the impact? So we'll talk about tools related to this later on in the session. And then the kind of final phase of this continuous cycle is the phase of establishing a risk management plan. So once you develop a response plan, how will you carry that plan out with your team? How will you make steps to prevent this risk from occurring again? And how does the mitigation plan adjust to how your team is conducting activities? So how are you going to integrate your response plan to risk within your project flow? And just one thing to emphasize is that risk management and mitigation is a cyclical activity. You will need to constantly be aware of potential risks to your project. And each time a risk is identified, you need to have your steps in place for how you will address that particular risk. And whether that's during your check-in meetings with project staff and or the funder. Okay, and so the next phase here, we're just going to go into each of those phases and talk a little bit more about what it is that you can do with your project to address and manage your risk. So to identify risk, it's important to have risk management be a part of your project planning from the beginning. You will want to establish tools or techniques your team will use throughout the project's life. A few ways to identify risk include brainstorming with your team during a check-in call. You can make this an agenda item on a once a month meeting topic, or just integrate it within your workflow, within your check-ins, whether that's monthly or quarterly, to just really talk about what your staff see as potential risks. And another tool is something called a risk register. And so a risk register is a document that you use that is updated, like a simple Word document with a table where you list your identified risk. And for each identified risk, you will also want to add in details, like list out potential responses, what is the potential cause of that particular risk, and if anything needs to be addressed, you want to categorize it, the impact, the probability, is it high, low, and then you'll update that continuously throughout your project. So you always have in one central place that everyone can access what identified risks have been, what are steps that you've taken for things that have come up. Okay, and the next one then is analyze and prioritize. And so I kind of got into that, I was jumping ahead, but for each risk identified, it is important to determine its priority. So again, going back to the probability and the impact. And so you'll want to categorize the high, low, and medium, and you want to try to minimize or eliminate as best as you can. So once you analyze the risk for the project and priority, this will help you determine what your response should be. And so that's when we have to develop a response plan. So if the probability of your risk is high and the impact is high, this will likely be a high priority risk, and you'll want to develop a response. So there are a number of choices that you can use in situations where you have a high priority risk and it needs attention. And so there are different ways you can go about addressing it. And so one, maybe avoid it entirely. You can try to identify ways to eliminate the cause of the risk, thereby removing the threat. So that's where you can just, move around the risk if you can. The next is then to mitigate. So sometimes it's not possible to eliminate your threat, and so you may have to identify a way to reduce the impact to your project. Another choice is to maybe accept the risk, and so that is to accept the impact of the risk to your project, and so maybe that's time or cost lost because of the risk. And this acceptance may need to be communicated to your funder or your community stakeholders. So if it's something that's unavoidable and something that you can't necessarily mitigate, but the impact is maybe not as bad as it may have seemed at the beginning, and it won't impact your budget, it won't impact the deliverables or the quality, you may want to consider talking to your funder about this particular risk and get their input, and maybe it makes more sense to the project overall just to accept the risk. And then the last choice is try to escalate the risk. If a risk cannot be handled by you, it should be elevated to the program director or the funder. So as a project manager, as you're working through all of the risks, you see that this is beyond what you're able to address, and so you'll want to bring it to your project director or to your funder. And so a final note about developing a response plan is that a strategy needs to include the project manager, the project team, and in many instances, the funder. And so you'll want to document the response to the risk in your risk register. And then again, this is just emphasizing that once you've established a plan for how your team will manage risk, you will need to integrate this practice into a regular and routine process. Include risk assessments as part of your team's project meetings. Mitigating risk requires constant awareness of the changes your project faces, and understanding your SOW and your work plan will help you. And your team will notice changes or decisions. If everyone's keeping up and regularly monitoring and checking in, your staff will be able to easily recognize what might negatively impact your project. And so now we'll shift into discussing a few examples and working through the risk identification, analysis, and response. Okay, and so for this example, a project staffer announced that she is leaving. She has been the lead point of contact for community members on an outreach campaign. And so the identified risk for this particular project is the loss of project knowledge that this particular staffer has. And then also the loss of trust established with the community. So if the community trusts this person, they may be unwilling to work with a new project person. And so the risk analysis here is that the probability of this occurring is high. She is indeed leaving the project. The impact is also high because you need your community for this particular hypothetical, you need your community to engage with your program staff to complete your work. And so that impact can be high. And so a set of a risk response plan for this particular scenario might be to prepare a transitional document that highlights key project work in progress. And you'll want the staffer that's exiting to go ahead and document the work that they've done, the steps that they've taken, what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, and this can then be used for the incoming staffer to orient themselves and be able to more quickly jump into her shoes. And then another step is to plan for cross-training and shadowing before the staff departs. So you want the exiting staffer to work with your incoming staff and have the exiting staff train the new staffer and have her follow her maybe for a day as she does, as she conducts outreach within the community so that she can see the process, maybe even introduce the community members to the new staffer, and so kind of do a warm handoff. And then another thing is to go ahead and communicate with the community stakeholders. Let them know that there's going to be a transition occurring and what they can expect from your team because of this departure. So it's important to also keep your stakeholders involved for this particular case. And then again, you'll want to notify your funder of a change in primary project staff. So I want to go ahead and just take a few moments to go ahead and highlight this particular scenario. Staff turnover is common among programs, and so how can you plan for, mitigate just even before you start your project? And so one of those is balancing workloads. It's important not to burn out your staff, and oftentimes we find ourselves wearing many hats, and sometimes those hats can be very heavy, and it has an impact on our health and our ability to perform the work. So it's always important to be mindful of that and to balance workloads, that no one is taking on too much, and that there is a way that everyone is not feeling too much stress and burning out. And then also centralized project documents. So always make sure that everyone has access to the same documents so that not just one person is the keeper of all of the information and knowledge for your project. And then compensation. It's important to make sure that your staff are adequately paid for the level of effort that they're providing, for the time and effort that they're giving to your project, to as much as your project can allow. And then establish project onboard process. So make sure that you have a plan in place for if an employee decides to step out, that you already know what you're going to do once a new person comes in to orient them to the project so that it's a seamless transition for everyone. So the next example is it is not safe to hold in-person meetings due to COVID-19. And so this is something that all of us are experiencing right now. And so I wanted to go ahead and just try to play this out in some ways that you may already have done for your projects. And the identified risk is that perhaps you have 3 in-person meetings scheduled during the grant award period. And so the risk analysis is the probability is high. You're not going to be able to hold in-person meetings. And the impact is also high because you have a budget associated with in-person meetings. And so you're going to need to develop a risk response plan for that. So you can go ahead and plan for in-person meetings to shift to virtual settings. That's one way to go ahead and continue to have outreach of some kind with your target population. Virtual is a very good alternative. And then you'll want to schedule meetings with the funder to discuss options. This is something that will have an impact to your budget and to your staff, and so it'll be important to engage with your funder right away. So in leading up to the meeting with your funder, you're going to want to look at your budget. How is this shift from in-person to virtual going to impact your budget? Is it going to cost more? Is it going to cost less? And so these are some details you want to bring to your discussion with your funder when you talk about how to address in-person meetings moving to virtual. Okay, and the next example here is you're working with a vendor, and this is perhaps pre-COVID because it's about meeting space, but the vendor overbooked conference space and canceled your conference room reservation, but offered an alternative date a month later. So the identified project risk here is that the event was scheduled to occur in the last month of the grant period, and the proposed date by the vendor is outside of the grant award period. So the risk analysis here is that the probability of this occurring is high. You no longer have your space that you've been planning on for months. And then the impact is also high because, again, you have a large number of budget dollars associated with this particular event. And so this does rise to the level of needing to create a risk response plan. And so that includes reaching out to potentially find an alternative event site. So maybe there's other vendors in the area that you might be able to switch your venue to. And another is to go ahead and schedule a meeting with your project officer to discuss options. And this other alternative options might be to extend your grant award period by a month or two. And this would lead to a no-cost extension. So just you'll want to look at your budget and see if you would have the staffing capacity to extend your project life for another 2 months to include the proposed new dates from the vendor, and then bring those kind of discussion details to the meeting with your project officer. And so the no-cost extension might be an option for this case. Okay, so that is everything that I have for the risk and mitigation and budgeting. At this point, we'll go ahead and take some questions on the material.